own childhood, which was pretty rocky and bumpy. My mum had me as an unplanned pregnancy in her later teenage years. And my parents split up before I was born. So, I kind of came into this world, it was a bit of a shock for everyone involved. And my mum then married when I was 3 years old to a man that she was sort of pretty much forced into marrying to give me a respectable home. So she was, married young to, into an unhappy marriage with a young child. And I grew up in that situation, really not seeing family and motherhood as all that great. And also, it's a generational thing as well. I was born in 1964. As I was kind of coming of age, growing up through the 70s, the opportunities that were starting to happen for women, the women's liberation movement and first wave feminism were really kind of waking things up. And, my mum was, she was young, and she very much kind of gave me the impression that there was a world out there for me that hadn't been out there for her, and that she wanted me to take advantage of that. So I had these dual messages growing up of kind of that children sort of ruin your life, which is kind of, the message I picked up, that was also picked up at school as well as a teenager, I mean, really, it was like getting pregnant young ruins your life. But the message they kind of gave us was, very much, it will be the end of everything if you get pregnant. Mm. So I was not focused at all on the idea of having a family as a young woman. So much so that when I got pregnant at 20, I chose to have an abortion because I was absolutely terrified of becoming a mother. Terrified of, I think, repeating my own childhood, terrified of, my life being finished and over. And when it was just getting started, I'd only been living in London for a year. I was a kind of what's now called an intern at a fashion PR agency, which was, the work I really wanted to do. It was like it was all starting to fall into place for me. So I didn't regret the abortion. It was tough. I had it on the National Health Service, and I had to wait 3 months for the abortion. So, that was really tough emotionally, kind of knowing all of that time during the early pregnancy that I wouldn't be going ahead with it. And then that relationship didn't survive, even though my boyfriend at the time was lovely and would have had the baby with me. And then I went on to meet the man who would later become my husband. And quite early on in our relationship, I said to him, I don't think I want to have children. And he was like, okay. And, this huge conversation. And then we got married when I was 26, which, looking back on it, I was so young. Well, I felt, really, really old and grown up. And at 29, I kind of changed my mind because children were no longer this idea of just this, this kind of abstract, concept. They had become our children, the product of our combined DNA, of our love and our life. And then I thought, yeah. So I kind of said, actually, I do want to have children. And he was like, okay. So, these are conversations that can, destroy relationships. And in both cases, for me, it was, it was like no big deal. But I couldn't get pregnant. And I was completely, unshakably convinced that I would. So I actually didn't seek any help for a few years. It was 3 years before I had an operation, a laparoscopy, which is where they put a camera through your tummy button to have a look around, because I was concerned that there was some damage from the abortion. And the very avuncular surgeon who performed the operation, when I came round from it, said, first class uterus. Finest property I've seen all week. You lovely young people just go away and have lots of sex. That was it. That was the total advice that I got. And, looking back on it now, even when I went for the follow-up appointment, with the gynecologist, it's kind of really shocking because I was 33 and tried to conceive for nearly 4 years. All of my hormone profiles and examinations were fine, and so were my husband's. And there was a moment there for education that was missed, which was I knew nothing about the aging quality of eggs. I knew nothing about 35 being a kind of, a really key date in a woman's fertility. All we were told to do, I wasn't even suggested that we have further investigations, we consider IVF, nothing. It was just like, everything's fine, go away and carry on. And so we did, and nothing happened. And I then entered a period of what I call baby mania, just, doing everything I possibly could to get pregnant, visiting every alternative therapist, nutritionist, acupuncturist, giving up this, taking up that, starting exercise, leaving a job because it was next to a polluted road, having sex at the right times, peeing on every colour of stick. I mean, I do remember one exhausting month that I insisted that my husband and I, that we have sex every single day for a month, because I just said, there's just no way we can miss it then. And that sounds like fun, but anyone who's been through trying to get pregnant knows that after a while it becomes quite sad that, that this is what you're trying to conceive and it's not working. And I didn't get pregnant. And by the time we arrived at the point where it was really time to start thinking about IVF, the marriage was in a really bad state. My then husband, we're no longer married, had developed sort of his workaholism had tipped over into alcoholism, and then into sort of heavy drug use as well. And things were just such a mess. And I remember when he said to me, I was lying in the bath, he was cleaning his teeth, and he said, I think we should do IVF. And I just had this moment, this sinking moment in my soul. I thought, I can't bring a baby into this, And it was shocking and very sad. And it was also, for me, actually a deeply maternal decision, because I grew up in chaos, and I didn't want my children to grow up in chaos. And possibly not that surprisingly, the marriage unraveled from that point onwards. And so I left the marriage. I was back out into the brave new world of internet dating at age 38. I mean, I was out there so fast because of this baby mania. I thought, I've got to meet someone else and do IVF. No idea that the chance of it working was so small. No idea that actually I was already at the beginning of perimenopause. I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about any of these kind of really important pieces of information. I just didn't know. And I had 2 relationships post-divorce. Neither of them were right to bring children into. One guy didn't want children. The other guy did, but actually is quite lucky I wasn't able to get pregnant naturally, because he was a raging narcissist, very controlling and coercive. It was hugely difficult to get out of that relationship. And when I did, I was 44 and a half. It was done. Even with my ignorance about fertility, I knew that, well, if I met someone now, I'd need to know them for at least a year before we could consider IVF. I'll be 45. It's done. That would be the end of my journey. So that was the end of my journey towards motherhood, and the beginning of my journey towards coming to terms with my childlessness.
I think what you say about it being a deeply maternal decision is such a valid point. And it's actually a beautiful way of putting it, because sometimes when people, it's only when you don't have children that you start seeing the difference between women who are childless by choice, women who are childless not by choice, all of the different subcategories of not having children. But it's always a deeply maternal decision, regardless of which category you fall into.
Yes. And for child-free women too.
Yeah.
I mean, I often hear, that child-free women are sort of, they're selfish and things like that. I mean, it's often said of childless women as well. And it's something I've really kind of thought about and discussed, with my child-free friends over the years. And when I've thought about it, well, let's just think about the alternative. Here is someone who is absolutely convinced that motherhood is not for them, Surely it would be much more selfish to have children if that's how you feel about it. In which case, because we all know what that looks like, because for millennia women haven't had the choice. There have been very many reluctant mothers. Some of us have even been brought up by them.
Exactly. I think that's exactly just highlights the points so well. And what are the statistics at the moment for women without children? Because I know that that's a lot of what you do in Gateway Women.
Yeah, I mean, it varies. It varies from country to country. For my cohort, so born in the 60s, we reached 1 in 5 over the age of 45 don't have children. That's the first time it was so high since the generation born around 1900, which really shows. And that generation had the massive loss of life in the First World War of so many young men, followed by the Great Depression of the 1930s, which meant a lot of couples couldn't marry and have children. So, when you see it took the biggest war, with the loss of life we've ever had and the biggest global depression to create these numbers before, you begin to really understand what a huge social moment this is. Now, for the generation or the cohort coming up behind me, those born in the 1970s, we don't have all of the data yet because they haven't all got to the point where they've turned 45. Actually, early information for those born around 1971 in the UK is it's about sort of 1 in 6. But I think it's going to get much higher because, if my inbox is anything to go by, I think it will be certainly 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 4. I think for the millennial generation coming up behind that, it is going to be really high.
I know that the statistics for women having their first child is changing. It is now much older than what it used to be, having their first children. I
can't remember the exact data, but it's something like, and this data is coming out of the US, that the millennial generation, the amount of them turning 30, women turning 30 without having had their first child, has gone up from about 12% to almost 50. So in a generation. Now, obviously, many of those young women will have children in their 30s. But a lot of them will probably age out of the process, as so many of us did, because maybe they'll start trying in their mid-30s, maybe they won't find a partner, maybe they'll choose to remain child-free. But I think for the generation coming up behind us with the huge economic pressures on them, it's so hard to set up a home, to earn a good enough living to bring up children now because of the cost of living. Plus the sort of the sense of social and economic fragility and environmental fragility in the world. I think that their thoughts about becoming a parent are going to be very, very different.
And before we go into all the other questions, can you tell me how Gateway Woman came about and what the process was? What is Gateway Woman and who is it for?
Okay, so Gateway Women is for women who are childless, not by choice. I sometimes say childless by circumstance, but that is slowly starting to mean women who are childless for any other reason other than infertility or choice, where for me, circumstance includes infertility. So I now say childless, not by choice, because that kind of encompasses it all. It started as a blog 7 years ago. 7 years ago this month, I wrote my very first blog, and I wrote that blog because nobody would let me talk about it. Whenever I would try to discuss how I felt about my childlessness to friends or family or anyone, they would close me down with a selection of what I came to call miracle baby stories. I'm younger looking than my age. I always have been. Oh, well, you've still got loads of time. And why don't you have a baby on your own? I'm around about 40, I'm kind of 46 when I'm having these conversations. It's not like I'm not a spring chicken at this point. And, I met this woman, she met this guy at the bus stop, she's in remission, he's on remand, they've got twins, whatever it might be, whatever extraordinary story it would be. And the other ones are things like also sort of just closing me down by saying, actually, kids aren't all they're cracked up to be.
Yeah.
Really, you dodged a bullet. Why don't you have mine? You're so lucky. You get to sleep in and travel and do all this and blah, blah, blah. And really, you're so lucky not to have children. And the subtext of that is, why don't you appreciate it more and cheer up?
My favorite one is when they ask you. Yeah, I think the best one is when they say, why don't you just adopt?
Oh, don't you love the just?
Yeah, why don't you just adopt? Like I'm going to go off and wash my hair like.
Yeah. Well, it's extremely difficult to adopt. Even if you are ready for that and set up for that. I mean, I was single, self-employed, broke, not living in a house that I owned. I mean, I wouldn't have made it through the first hurdle. People don't realize that, actually that the bar is set pretty high. And also from the many women I've supported through Gateway Women, I know how many people get turned down for adoption, how many people, after years of being in the matching process, just give up. It's tough. It's a tough process as a couple, let alone as a single woman.
And it's not necessarily the solution, and certainly not the solution that you're looking for at the time where you're in the highest point of your grief, or when, as you say, you're just trying to share where because it's also about processing those emotions and processing your identity and your place in society.
Well, those conversations are really what I set up Gateway Women to have, because you can't have them sort of out there in the pronatalist world. It's very hard to have those conversations. And so I wrote that first blog, and I thought, well, if one woman reads this and gets it, that would be great. And actually, quite a lot of women read it. And I got my first piece of PR the day after my first blog was published. And, women from all over the world started writing and commenting on the blogs and, saying, how can you know the exact words in my head? I thought I was the only person feeling these things. And also something which I didn't realize was so special about it was that I used my real name. I had my photograph on there. I did not hide. I for some reason, I did not feel some of the level of shame around my childlessness that some women do. I think perhaps because I'd been through so much healing in the 12-step programs, where I'd been through a program called Al-Anon, which it's for friends and family of addicts and alcoholics, for a couple of years, which had really saved my sanity after my marriage broke down and helped me understand the mechanics of of loving someone with a substance abuse problem. And also my own part in that, the codependency that had built up. So I'd had a couple of years of sitting in a room talking about things you're not meant to talk about. So I think that really helped me to be very comfortable with sort of breaking taboos. And I broke a huge taboo by being open about childlessness.
And what was the most difficult aspect of not having children for you to come to terms with?
Gosh, there are so many. And my feeling of which is the most difficult varied at different points in my journey. I think at first it was the sense of grief of not having a biological child, never being a mother, never giving birth. And then from there, I kind of moved on into absolute fear and terror about growing old without children, about having no legacy in this world, about no one ever visiting my grave, about never having really mattered. And I think, another huge aspect for me was how it impacted my friendship groups and my status as a woman. And, really my friendship groups just kind of falling apart because of, me not being a part of the normal crowd. I was the only one. I was the only one who didn't have children. I have, 2 friends who are child-free by choice. One of whom I'm close to and one of whom is slightly on the periphery of my life, if you know what I mean. But I didn't know anyone else who had wanted to be a mum and it hadn't worked out. I knew people who'd had fertility problems and they'd had treatment and it had worked. People who'd adopted, people who'd had last minute babies, people who had babies on their own, the whole thing. But I didn't know anyone for whom, who was coming to terms with childlessness, and the loneliness of that, the intense loneliness of that part of my experience, because I was also single, childless. It felt like I was friendless, and I felt like a zero as a human being and a zero as a woman. It was an existential dark night of the soul of such profundity.
How did you honor that grief and loss? Because I feel that it's such an important aspect of coming to terms with not having children, is really honoring the grief. And that's so much, it's something that is not always possible. It's certainly not something, it's not there's not many opportunities for for honoring that grief and loss. So you have to create them yourself.
Yeah.
It's a bit like miscarriage.
Yeah.
There's no opportunities offered for honoring the grief and loss of losing a child. It's, same thing. It's, you can have another one. You're still young. All the same platitude. But more so when it's not having children at all. So how did you, first of all, realize that you had to honor it? And then what did you do to honor it?
Well, I had no idea it was grief at first. The first couple of years, which were really before I started the blog, I didn't realize that what I was experiencing was grief. I was seeing doctors, I was seeing therapists, and nobody picked up that the reason I was struggling so much was actually my childlessness. It is extraordinary to me that it was not identified, it was not named, it was not held. It wasn't until I was in my, I think it was my first or my second year of my training to become a psychotherapist. And we did this training on bereavement. And, we're doing this training and I'm thinking, this is all very familiar. And I went home that evening from the first day of the training and kind of mapped the Kubler-Ross model that we'd been learning around grief and loss against my experience. And I realized just like, oh my God, I'm grieving. I've got goosebumps now because it was a moment that changed my life. Because finally I had a name for what I was experiencing. And also for the first time, I had a little bit of hope, because although, number one, I knew this meant I wasn't going mad. And I was worried that, I was kind of losing my mind because I was trying everything to feel better and nothing was working. And number two, I thought, well, I don't know quite how this happens, but I know that grief ends. I know that people grieve and then they come out the other side of it. So it's like this, I'm not always going to feel like this. I don't know how, but somehow I'm going to get through this. It was the first bit of hope that I was going to get through this. I wasn't going to feel this bad for the rest of my life. So at that point, I became a bit of a grief junkie. I just read everything I could. I was looking out there for resources. I was not finding anything related to childlessness at all. So I started writing about it on my blog, and women from all over the world, a lot of them found out that they were grieving through my work. And when you say, what did I do to honor that loss? I think for me, writing about it and then bringing women together. Because it wasn't long. I started the blog in April. I gave my first talk about grief in June. So it's all happening around the same time. And, at that talk, women are saying to me, you seem to understand what's happening in a way that no one else is talking about or writing about. Can you sort of do something about it? I was like, me? I just felt like a complete basket case at that point in my life. The idea that I had anything to offer, was like absurd. But once again, because of my experience in the 12-step groups, I just thought, well, I know the power of peer-to-peer healing. I don't need to be sorted. What if I just create an experiment? What if I just bring some childless women together, create a safe and confidential space, create a structure for what we're going to talk about, and let's see what happens. And that's what the very first Gateway Women groups were about. It was that. And it was the first one I did. It was a 10-week group, 10 Saturday mornings. We went through many of the steps, which later then, made it into my book. And it was completely transformational. And so for me, honoring my grief was also about creating a sacred space for women to honor their grief together. And I didn't understand it at the time, but I now understand that grief is a social emotion. And we need others who get it in order for it to be processed and move through and heal us.
Well, I'm a firm believer that we have a life path to follow. And that sometimes means accepting things that we didn't think we wanted or didn't think we had planned. If you had an opportunity to turn back the clock and change anything, what, if anything, would you do differently?
I think I would have done things differently when my marriage ended, had I known about fertility. I wish I'd known at 37, 38 that actually my time was up, because it was for me. And those first few years post-divorce would have been very different, and would have been about me and me finding myself again, rather than throwing myself headlong into a series of unsuitable relationships, desperate to have a child. So I think I would have, I would have loved to have understood more about my fertility actually right from school onwards. That would have made a big difference to my life and my choices. Yeah. I'd like to have done, I would have done fertility differently.
And yet somehow that's led you on this path that you've ended up helping so many thousands of women around the world, and really highlighting the issue that surrounds with our children.
Yes.
And, in many ways, I'm quite fortunate in my role as a midwife that it gives me the opportunity to nurture and mother mothers. But I know that while I hold a very valuable role and a space, I never really belong with them. I do acknowledge that. Can you speak a little bit more about belonging and how you manage it in your life now?
Oh goodness, belonging. We might need a whole other topic for that one.
It's a big one, isn't it?
I think it's one of, I think it's possibly, once we're through, I mean, you can't really separate it out from the grief, but it is something which continues. I mean, even though I'm no longer grieving, the kind of the issue of belonging is still a very big one. And it's one I support so many women with. I think for me, I felt that I not only didn't belong in the kind of community of mothers, I felt that I didn't belong in the community of women anymore. And, probably at the depths of my grief, I actually sort of didn't feel I kind of belonged to the human race anymore. I felt that I was just a kind of a reject. And I remember there's a place in southwestern France where I visited a lot, and where I kind of, I wrote my book, and I wrote the second edition of my book. And there's a walk that I take up in the mountains on my own. And it's because it's the same walk every time. When I'm there, different seasons, I see the seasons changing. And I used to find it incredibly painful, because I had this sense of that my connection with nature, which had always been so profoundly healing to me as a child and as a young woman, had also gone, because I felt that even nature had rejected me, that I was not part of this cycle of birth and death, that I didn't even belong to to nature anymore. And then as my healing progressed, one day I realized that for me, although I wasn't part of the human cycle of procreation, that my line stopped, which is a huge issue to deal with, this sense that, the millions of years of genetic feats of survival that created us stop here. It's a massive one to get your head around. So although I wasn't part of that story, I was part of the bigger story of, the bigger cycles of life and death. And, that when I die, my body will return to the earth and will turn back into base elements and will, become mulch, and then will turn back into flowers, and then life will come again. And I kind of connected to a much larger sense of life and death than the small circle that I had felt so ejected from. And that was a big part for me of beginning to feel like I belonged on the earth again, which was, really necessary, because that's how much I felt I didn't belong. And then gradually, I found my tribe through other childless women. I've set up the Gateway Women meetups and online communities, and I met, childless women from all around the world. I have some wonderful childless friends in my life now, which supplemented those few friends that I did manage to hang on to through, from my original friendship groups. And I think now I feel part of the tribe of women, but I think I feel, and I always have done, a little bit of an outsider. I was perhaps wanting to be a mum for me was also about it was my last ditch attempt to join the ranks of the normal people. I've had an unusual life. I've always been slightly different to other women my age, whether that's taller than them or, more interested in them in education, or I've always seemed to have been slightly, I hate to say it because it sounds boastful, but a bit ahead of the curve. But the thing about being ahead of the curve means you're a little bit outside the norm. So I just started to connect with other leaders and thinkers in this world of kind of supporting childless women. I have an amazing group on Facebook, which is just for the women around the world who do this kind of work, like yourself. And I thought, okay, I have a tribe. It's not the tribe I thought I wanted, but it is full of kick-ass, awesome women who have found a way to make peace with their childlessness in a world that does not accept our value as women, in the same way that it does as mothers. So it's taken work. I won't deny it. But I think, first of all, I had to feel I belonged to myself again. And then gradually my life became richer in belonging. And another, which is one key more point I've just remembered about that, as I started to accept that I would definitely never be a mother and I would never belong to the society and the culture and the land in that way, once I let that go completely, I began to realize that my life had lots of belonging in it, but it was belonging I wasn't interested in before, so I was ignoring it. So, there are lots of young people in my life through my ex-husband who has he's one of 6 siblings. And, they've all known me since the day they were born. They really cared for me. I have, friends and colleagues. It's like, my pets. I realized that actually I was very much loved and very much part of groups. I was seen as being part of groups, but I wasn't feeling it. I felt so alone. So I actually had to learn how to allow the belonging that was being offered in my life in as well.
Because it was so different to the belonging you had in mind. I totally get that.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. That really resonates with me because I've felt very similar on my journey. And certainly the not belonging has been a huge one for me. And I really, I know I went through a stage of also thinking, you feel worthless. You really do feel, what is the point? If you can't do that, what is the point? And it's so difficult to explain. So you've put it into words so beautifully, just really explaining how many issues are unearthed when you are unable to have a baby, to create life,
absolutely,
to continue that life cycle. It is associated with absolutely every aspect of our life. And so we examine every aspect of our life in an effort to come to terms with it. And we have to reframe every aspect of our life in order to do that and change everything. And I think belonging is just one of them. But what you say is so relevant, how you just have to realize that you belong in so many other ways, but we will never belong to the mummy club, essentially.
Yeah.
We'll never be part of that. And I mean, I'm so closely associated with it and I'm part of it every single day, but I will never belong. And even in my work with mums, I see how my role changes. I'm so valued during their pregnancy and those first few weeks when I'm really helping them. And then I see them step into motherhood. I see them become mothers. And then it changes. And the friendship and the relationship, professional, personal, in every way, just shifts. The balance shifts. And it used to really throw me when I was younger and when I was still coming to terms with it. Now I find it actually quite beautiful because there's an element.
I was going to say, it's probably a really important part of their process too, that shift happens.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful watching, and it's beautiful letting them go and saying, right, it's like little birds, there you go, off you go. You're on your own now. I've done my bit. But it was difficult initially. I wanted to kind of like be able to say, I remember this and I remember that. Well, I don't. I remember it with 100 women or 1,000 women that I've helped, but I just don't have my own experience to impart in that story. Right. So, yeah. Wow. Where do you think that the change needs to occur in order for society to become more accepting or even understanding of the fact that, one, so many more women are either choosing to be childless or are childless by not by choice. Because, as you say, the statistics are changing. It's definitely becoming more. And I do think it's more, as you say, of by choice. But even when it's by choice, they're still going to face the same landmines and the same issues.
I mean, exactly. I mean, they have a different internal experience to it, not most of the time, but not always. Child-free women don't experience a grieving process. And also they don't experience the shame that so many childless women feel, because this is an identity they've chosen and they're proud of it. So, they come at it from a very different space most of the time. Their stories are often a lot more complex, as all of us are, than people realize.
Yes.
But as you say, they face the same social landmines. I don't know, where to start. I mean, the ideology that underpins the difficulties that women have, with the whole motherhood identity issue is called pronatalism. And this is the conditioning that says that the only fully adult way to be a member of society is to be a parent, and that all other forms of adulthood are lesser than that. It underpins everything that we're talking about. It's one of the things that makes coming to terms with childlessness so difficult. It's one of the things that propels women into motherhood, perhaps without really understanding what they're doing or whether it's really the right decision for them. It's where the whole myth of the fantasy of how amazing motherhood is going to be is kind of starts. Yeah. And this idea that this is really the only way to be a real woman. Now, really, we're going to have to dismantle the ideology of pronatalism, and this is a huge task. Most people haven't even heard of the word. I mean, when I sort of, and I'll say, and when I use words like ideology, sometimes people are like, oh no, here she goes. And it's like, well, just what is ideology? Well, if you asked a fish, how's the water? The fish would say, what's water? That is ideology. It is the conditioning all around us that tells us how the world is, and how things are and how things are meant to be. Pronatalism is part of that conditioning. It is a conditioning which is really, really old-fashioned and past its time. It's had a massive boost in the last 25 years. I think it's very interesting. I think we're experiencing a moment of huge social backlash, which is operating unconsciously, to turn back. It's not going to work, but to turn back the tide that's happened with so much rising equality for women, which has happened in our lifetimes. In a way, it's almost like, okay, so you've got jobs and you can earn your own living and you can buy your own flats and you can drive your own cars and all these things that even a generation ago was really hard to do. I mean, a woman couldn't get a mortgage a generation ago in her own name even. And, you've got all these things, you've got all this equality. So in a way, by suddenly making motherhood, the ultimate achievement for women, it's a way of kind of pushing back against the idea that a female equality. It's really interesting because when I was growing up, in the 70s, motherhood did not have this exalted status. It was something women did. It was private. It was a little bit embarrassing. It was not cool. I mean, in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, when the then Princess of Wales was pregnant, she had this huge billowing maternity smock, and it was quite private. She couldn't hide the fact that she was heavily pregnant, but you know what I mean? People were quiet and respectful. This was a private matter, and you kind of fast forward a generation to when Beyonce was pregnant a couple of years ago. Do you remember those extraordinary pictures of her? I mean, she nearly broke the internet with, these pictures of her head.
One of the Kardashians who had a baby, I think, on live TV or something equally as bizarre.
Oh Lord, I'm glad I missed that.
Yeah, one of them did a live stream YouTube or something.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, I just take a moment to take that one in. But this is the sense of that motherhood and pregnancy has moved from something private to something very public and says something about you as a woman. You have arrived as a woman in a way that it didn't in the 70s when feminism was on the rise. And certainly my mother's friends when I was growing up did not spend all their time talking about children. If anything, they were really pleased. You know, there were grown-up conversations and the children had to go to bed, and then the women got to talk about something else. You know, they finally got to talk about, so there's a really massive cultural shift in terms of an over-privileging of the public role and status of motherhood. Now, I am not running down the individual status of motherhood, you know, how important motherhood is to families and children. It's this very public fetishizing of motherhood that I find problematic. And I think it's really problematic for mothers as well as childless women, because it gives it a sheen and a gloss that many women, when they then become mothers, realize is actually smoke and mirrors, because it's a tough job.
I can completely agree with that, because that's what I see with the mums I work with. You know, the expectations are so high, the pressures are so high, and because of the
I can't say it either, it's a tough word.
That word.
Fetishization
of it. You know, there's this expectation that they have to be back to their birth weight within 6 weeks, looking glorious, looking great, out and about with the baby, in the perfect bouncer, in the perfect stroller, in the perfect outfit. It's very difficult, and the pressures to be a good parent are so high. And yet parenting, and you know, this sounds rich coming from me, but just in my experience of helping parents, it's a journey, it's a process. Just like we had to process accepting that we would never be parents, those who become parents have a process towards becoming a parent. We're not born parents. The baby is born and we become parents through trial and error, through trying different things. But, you know, social media makes it look as if, you know, from the day your baby comes home, this is how it is, and this is the picture, and this is what it looks like. But nobody talks about what it feels like, and it doesn't always feel the same as it looks. So it is very, very difficult.
Yeah, and I think another huge taboo that's being broken at the moment is mothers talking, those mothers who regret having children talking about it, which is a massive taboo, because it's this idea, well, that means you don't love your children, which is absolutely ridiculous, because it's like, no, if I had known that what motherhood was going to really be like, I might have kind of waited longer, I might have made different choices. But it's not saying I don't love my children. It's saying actually motherhood is really, really hard. And you know, I was sold a lie. Absolutely. And I really applaud those women who are saying that. And you know, the fact that many of them have to do it anonymously, I understand, because I can imagine, you know, to read that that's what your mother said about you once you're grown up is not going to help anyone.
Yeah. And I think it just comes back to society having to change to accept all women, regardless of whether they have children, whether they haven't got children, whether they've got children and realize, wow, that wasn't quite for me, but just accepting and supporting everybody on their own journey.
Yes. And I, you know, I think for childless women, not by choice, you know, part of my journey was really coming through the envy and the fantasy. So I had to break through the fantasy of motherhood that I'd absorbed, to really see the life of my friends with children and really kind of take the blinkers off and see that it's hard. It's a different human journey to my life. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. You know, I had to break through that fantasy in order to find my freedom. And I think for mums, it can be difficult for them to appreciate that the lives of their friends who are childless or child-free aren't always about white sofas and lie-ins and holidays. That actually, you know, the process, the coming through the existential process of coming to terms with childlessness, dealing with, you know, aging alone, dealing with, you know, society's ideas about us on a daily basis is really challenging. You know, we have not got a free ticket to some kind of amazing life, and neither have they. You know, they're just different ways of being women that equally value.
I love that. I mean, I think that's the whole point of it, is that We all have our challenges. And as you say, it's not a free ticket to joy, endless joy, one way or the other. Each of our paths have got their own challenges, and neither of them are better. And they can't even really be compared because they are so completely different. But there's good and bad to both. So just before we end this off and go to some what I call quick fire questions, I would love it if you could just share a little bit more about Gateway Woman and possibly even the summit that you're running at the moment.
Well, I'm part of the We Are Worthy Summit, and that's weareworthysummit.com, which is a week-long of free programming run by Andrew and Nikki Fletcher and Brandy Little of the Childless Not by Choice magazine, which is also a really great magazine. It's an online magazine and the first in the world. And we've got amazing speakers from all over the world, women and a couple of men too, talking about the many, many different aspects of infertility and childlessness, not by choice. And I did a seminar last week. I'm doing another one this week. Last week was on finding your plan B. This week is on coping with other people, dealing with the challenges that childlessness creates in your friendships and relationships. And whenever you're listening to this recording, if you the recordings of the webinars, which I'll be doing live, will be on the We Are Worthy Summit website.
Sorry, will they be available after the summit ends?
Absolutely. They'll be up there for good. So you can go and find them at any time.
Fabulous. Right, so some quick fire questions, short and sharp, one word answers wherever possible.
Okay.
Who is your inspiration and why?
It sounds really corny, but it is Oprah. She's just someone who's turned her personal story into helping millions of others, and she just does it with such grace and energy. I just really admire her.
She's right up there. I totally get that. Do you feel like a leader or a follower?
Now, this is a really interesting question. I've had to think about it because I think I feel like both. And I think that's because my way of being a leader is that I'm very collaborative. You know, my thing is, we rise together. I like to support as many women as possible. I like to help them find their power too. So I generally don't tend to recognize myself as a leader, but I kind of forget that I am.
I would say that you're very definitely a leader. Definitely.
Yeah.
And what is the best piece of advice that you've received?
Do you know what? I've hardly had any good advice in my life. So I was thinking about this, and actually it was the advice that was given to someone else that they told me about, and I thought it was brilliant. And it was, right back at the beginning of my journey. I hadn't yet kind of really woken up to the fact I was going to be childless, and it was a woman a few years older than me. And she said that her therapist had said to her, "We are all a little broken, and that's okay." And I never forgot that. And that, I would love to say it was said to me, but it came to me through someone else, and it meant a lot.
I like that. It makes a lot of sense. What accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, I was the first person in my family to go to university. I went as a mature student at 28, and I absolutely loved it. I studied English literature in the evenings whilst working as well in London, and I graduated with a first-class degree and the university prize in English. And that was an amazing moment at my graduation to have my mother and my grandmother there for my graduation. And I guess I come from a long line of unfulfilled women, so it really felt like I broke the mold. I'm very proud of that and very proud of my book.
And so you should be. Best movie?
It's been my favourite for a long time. It hasn't been surpassed yet, and it's actually Blade Runner, the original one. And I was really thinking about that before our call, and I thought, why is that movie? And I just thought about it. It's about outsiders.
Oh.
It's about a group of people who aren't understood. It still is. It still really speaks to me.
Just really.
And I love science fiction.
Yeah.
People just do not expect that of me. I'm actually a science fiction junkie. I have been since I was a kid. I think I'm an I'm an idealist. I love to think about ways the world possibly could be.
Oh, I love that. I'm a great believer in that. Your favorite book?
Perhaps an unusual one. It's the very first spiritual book I read after my divorce and sort of beginning to find myself again. It's by an American Buddhist nun called Pema Chodron, and it's called When Things Fall Apart. And it is the most extraordinarily funny, wise little book about basically what happens when the shit hits the fan.
It's a beautiful.
And it is a beautiful. I recommend it to everyone who's struggling. Yeah, coming to terms with something that you really didn't see coming. That's the book.
She's an amazing woman too. She really is. And if you had a song for your life, what would that song be?
Do you know, I struggled with this and I wasn't able to find a song for my life, but I have thought of the song that feels good for me at the moment. And it's You're Just Too Good to Be True.
Oh, I love it.
And it's the version with and it's the version with Lauryn Hill and the Fugees. And I'm with a wonderful new partner that I met a couple of years ago after many years of being single and coming to terms with my childlessness. And, we're living together, we're madly in love. And the line is, I'm so glad I'm alive, It's about waiting and then love showing up. And that's something that has been a delightful surprise for me. I was very happily married when I was younger. I presumed that was it, that I'd had that experience. And I'm just delighted to say that at 54, I'm getting another go.
Woohoo! Great. So there's hope yet.
Yeah.
And the last question, your favorite quote?
Oh, it's been my favorite quote since school, So this one is really important. And it's from an American poet called Robert Frost. And I had this pinned up on my desk for many years. And it's the best way out is through.
Oh, I use that.
And now I work with grief. Yeah. It's the best way, the best way to deal with childlessness is to go through the grieving process and come out the other side.
Absolutely. Oh, it's been so great chatting to you and just hearing your insights and more about your story. I know I read your book, but it was years ago. So it kind of like brought some of the things back to me. And also for sharing all the ways that you are a leader. I hear what you're saying about bringing people together, but you need to be a leader in order to do that. And I just know how much you've done for women around the world in creating ways for women to get together, to share, to chat, to recognize that grief, to move beyond it. And on behalf of all those women, thank you, because it needs to be done. And I can't help but, now that I know your story, just hearing it directly from you, and just the fact that it started with a blog post and that it was 7 years ago, how much has changed and how much you've done. I truly believe that it was very much a part of your path to do that. And everything has just come together to move you forward, to create bigger and better things and to create a shift in society and the way we're seen and embraced. So thank you.
Thank you. When I was a little girl, I always wanted to leave the world a better place than I found it. Like I said, I've always been an idealist. I thought that was going to be by bringing up these amazing children, because of course they would have been amazing. And that didn't work out. But as you said, it turned out that my path has been to hopefully support individual women. And I really, really hope create some social change around the stories that we tell about childlessness.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much.